Now, we're in Psalm 15, continuing in our series, our Summer in the Psalms. As a reminder, if you have questions about the faith, you have questions about the sermon, even if you just want to say, this is ridiculous, defend it. If you have doubts, questions, and you want to ask those, you can do so anonymously through the address that's on the sermon page of our worship guide. And I take about 5 to 7 minutes to answer those questions if you have them after the sermon. So I just want to ask you this question as we dig into Psalm 15. Do you belong in this room? Are you holy enough to be here? Are you holy enough to be here? Have you thought about that? You considered the question, am I holy? Well, who gets to dwell with the Lord or stand on his holy hill is where Psalm 15 takes us. There's a kind of reframing of human life here. You might not have thought it was about this, and then suddenly the question is, well, are you holy? That's what David asks. So you might hear it and think that holy people are just good people, really good guys, good girls. As a matter of fact, you might be under the impression that holiness is all relative, right? You feel, I'm pretty holy because I'm sitting next to people who are less holy than me. Right? I'm not going to say for anybody a show of hands, but you might be sitting next to somebody who doesn't quite measure up to your level of holiness. They're not as good as you, therefore that makes you holy, right? Or you might think that holiness is just a really, really good person, a Mother Teresa type or someone like that who does lots of good things. That's what holiness is. Well, here's the thing. Sometimes you know an object by its image, and sometimes you know an object by what we call the negative space, the things around it, or what's left when it's taken away. If you're a gardener and you tend roses, you understand this principle. If somebody sees a flourishing rose bush, okay, you might think, wow, those roses are really beautiful. A skilled gardener will look at those same roses and think, I see all of the snips, all of the cuts, what's been taken away, what force has been exerted on this rose bush, because I know it doesn't get like that by itself. That's what's happening in Psalm 15. We're learning about God's holiness by what God leaves behind as he acts upon us. David is describing a holy life. But more than that, he's describing a holy God. As a matter of fact, he's describing holiness that is a gift for us. Not a thing to make you run out of here frightened. Not a standard to beat over the heads of your friends, but a gift. So how is holiness a gift? Well, we're first going to learn about how it's an intrusion. That in order to be a gift, it kind of has to make trouble, a good kind of trouble in our lives. And after it's done that, holiness also is gracious. And that once holiness has been both intrusive and gracious in our lives, it becomes a rule of life, okay? Holiness is intrusive and gracious so that it might become a rule of life. So let me walk us through this in Psalm 15. Okay? Psalm of David. It starts, who shall sojourn in your tent? Who will dwell on your holy hill? He who walks blamelessly and does what is right and speaks truth in his heart, who does not slander with his tongue. He does no evil to his neighbor, nor takes up a reproach against his friend. In whose eyes a vile person is despised, but who honors those who fear the Lord. Who swears to his own hurt. In other words, he keeps his commitment even when it's painful and does not change. Who does not put out his money at interest and does not take a bribe against the innocent. He who does these things shall never be moved. So the question of the psalmist is jarring. It immediately pushes you on your defensive, right? Who's holy? Who's holy enough? Who may ascend? So you might have had all kinds of ideas about what life is about, and then Psalm 15 says life is about ascending to be on the hill of the Lord. Now, if that's not enough, the kind of confrontational nature of Psalm 15, I'm going to make it more difficult for you and for me. There's a context for this psalm that you need to understand. In other words, a reason why it's written. So here's the context. There's a moment in the life of God's people and Israel that you need to know, and it involves the tabernacle and the temple. So the tabernacle was the holy RV that went along with God's people wherever they went, okay? It was where God's presence was housed and traveled in a tent that they assembled and took down. And inside that tent was the Ark of the Covenant, or the Ark of God's presence. And just like Noah's Ark was a container for God's people, this was a container for the tablets of the law, and above it, the mercy seat where God's presence rests among his people. All right? Pretty serious stuff. God's desire to be with his people was such that he traveled with them in a tent, though he was the maker of all things. And not only did he travel with them in a tent, but his love for them was such that there's a curtain that separated the presence of God and the Ark of the Covenant and God's people as they worshiped. His love for us and his desire to dwell with us was such that he understood it could consume us completely. So there was this separation, this presence. And so David is king of God's people, and they have the idea that what we're going to do is we're going to stop being the holy RV moving to wherever, and we're going to put it in a final resting location, okay? They're going to bring it up to Jerusalem. Sounds great. We're going to have a big moment. They get the people together that are going to move it. There's a big celebration. People are making all kinds of music. By the way, if you want to read about this, 2 Samuel 6, 1 Chronicles 13, and I always recommend, if you're going to read from the book of Samuel, to actually read it straight through in one sitting. It's really interesting. So they're going to bring the Ark of the Covenant up, and they have this, there are little details that I love. Like, they didn't just take any old cart to take the Ark of the Covenant. They had a new cart, right? Not some old dusty cart in someone's shed. Like, they got a new cart for this whole thing. Now, if you read 1 Chronicles 13, you'll find out they were actually supposed to carry the ark on poles, not on a cart, but that's neither here nor there for the moment, right? So they're moving this thing. They got the new cart. Everybody's excited. They're moving the Ark of the Covenant. They're singing. There's cymbals. It's amazing. There's dignitaries. Everybody's well-dressed. It's going to be wonderful. And then the oxen pulling the cart stumble. Now, you may know this story and what happens next. There's a man who's only known for this moment in Israel's life. His name is Uzzah. No one names their kids Uzzah anymore, and here's part of the reason why. So the ox stumbles, right? And again, this is all background for this psalm. As the ark is moving, or at least he was fearful of it moving and potentially falling off and hitting the ground, Uzzah reaches out to steady it. And what happens to him, do you know? He's killed. Yeah. The glee with which some of you shared that detail concerns me, okay? But he was killed, right? He's killed. Uzzah dies on the spot. He dies on the spot. Now, I think one reason why this story is always difficult for people is because it was Uzzah's goodness, in a sense, that killed him. He seemed to be doing a good thing. He wasn't hurting anybody, right? He's reaching out to grab the ark. But what he learns and what we learn is that all of Uzzah's goodness, good intentions, his preparation, his holiness, which we assume was significant to be one of the people minding the Ark of the Covenant, that the difference between God's holy and awesome presence and the very best that Uzzah could do to be a good guy wasn't enough. It was too great. And he struck down. Now I want to read to you what happens after this. So here's what happens. The anger of the Lord is kindled against Uzzah, and God struck him down there because of his error, and he died beside the ark of God. And David was angry because the Lord had broken out against Uzzah. That place is called Perez Uzzah, or God has broken out against Uzzah, to this day. Then, this is important, David was afraid of the Lord that day, and he said, how can the ark of the Lord come to me? There's real shadows of the beginning of this psalm. So David was not willing to take the ark of the Lord into the city of David, but David took it aside to the house of Obed-Edom, the Gittite, and the ark of the Lord remained in the house of Obed-Edom 3 months. The Lord blesses his family and all his possessions, right? It's a good thing to be the guy where the Ark of the Covenant stays in your house. He prospers. All kinds of goodness here, right? Now, David's psalm follows this story. The experience of the failure to bring up the ark leaves an impression on David, and he begins to talk about what it looks like for holiness to be at work in a person's life. He talks about all these qualities, and you start to learn that God's holiness is very intrusive. If you read through these 5 verses, you learn that you don't get to do whatever you want with your money. You don't get to say whatever you want. You don't get to treat anyone's reputation however you'd like. You don't get to be as nasty to your enemies as you want or as manipulative to your friends. You don't get to do whatever you like. Very intrusive. Holiness shapes us. Maybe you're the guy who takes an extra percentage off his clients because you can get away with it. Maybe you Facebook stalk your old ex because your husband will never know. Maybe you plagiarize your essays because everybody else is doing it. And when you hear about holiness, you have one of two reactions. Either one, I've got to break my neck and meet that standard, and I can because I'm good. Or you look at your life and you say, I could never be holy. I can never meet the standard. There can't possibly be holiness because this world is broken and I'm broken. It's not possible. So either arrogance or apathy. Apathy doesn't mean you don't care. That's a common misconception. Apathy means that there's nothing you can do to make a difference. We actually live in a generation of the apathetic. One study talks about the overwhelming presence of people who have gone through educational standards, who have gone to great schools and can't find jobs and find themselves back where they started, and they just lose drive. They don't believe anything they can do makes a difference. Some of us feel that way all the time. And when we read a text like, who may ascend the hill of the Lord's anointed, we think, not me. This holiness stuff is not for me. Now, it's only terrifying or annoying if we miss the gospel. So I want to take you not just to where grace, or not where holiness is intrusive, but where it's also gracious. Verses 1 through 2a begin to kind of take us on this journey. The language here, blamelessness. Now that's hard. You might read that, and in our current day, you might read blameless as being never sins, right? Now some of you might be sitting next to a blameless person in that regard, and it's so annoying, never sins, never makes a mistake, okay? Blamelessness is not that. As we understand it biblically, it is not never sins. It is blameless in regard to the law. And what I mean by that is this person has taken their sin where it's supposed to go and have applied the pardon of God to their lives. In other words, they've been covered by the blood of the sacrifice. For those of you who are familiar with the Old Testament system, you confess your sins, you leave an offering, and the sprinkling of blood is on you for an animal that has been slain. And that makes you blameless. You're not sinless. With respect to the law, you are blameless. So what David's saying immediately is he's saying, first of all, this person obeys and lives by the sacrificial system. Not they don't ever sin, but they make use of God's gracious care for them. They go to the temple and they receive absolution. They're covered in the sacrifice. They are clean before God. So David could not have said that this person needs to be blameless without the power of God to create a holy hill. Do you hear what I'm saying? David can't talk about blamelessness unless God is gracious. So David is talking about the holiness of God's holy hill. And on that place, he knows we are forgiven and covered. So he's talking about the fact that you and I, that God's holiness has to already go out before us and make a place holy. There has to be a hill, not just some hill, but God's holy hill. Now, you may say, come on, James. I know the Old Testament. The Old Testament is where people get smote. The Old Testament is where people get annihilated. The Old Testament is where God is constantly angry. You're just trying to read in this grace stuff to the Old Testament, okay? Let me help you. It's one of the reasons why Psalm 15 has suddenly become like my favorite psalm, right? Because here's the occasion. I told you about the context for the psalm. The context for the psalm is the kind of bringing up of the Ark of the Covenant. Now let me tell you the occasion for the psalm here. The reason that this particular one is written. Now, they pick up the ark again 3 months after Uzzah's death, remember? Right? It's in Obed-Edom's house, and I'm guessing if they asked Obed-Edom, it probably had one of two reactions. One, can't the ark stay a little bit longer? Or two, please get this thing out of here before it kills us all, right? So they go to take up the ark again. Obed-Edom, he gets rid of it. They're taking up the ark. Now, everything changes. This is not how they did it the first time. Now they've got Levites everywhere, priests everywhere. They're carrying it on the poles as they were told to carry it on the poles. They're celebrating, they're dancing, but here's the other thing they're doing. Every few steps, they're sacrificing. This is a bloody, messy, desperate affair. Gone is the, we're the people who bring the ark up from the covenant, and instead has been the, oh God, please don't kill us while we do this, right? It is the recognition that their closeness to God's holiness means they have to sacrifice, they have to be under the blood, or they're doomed. There's a story about an old Hasidic butcher who used to weep every day before he went out to do his work. As he left his family, he believed it might very well be the day that he never sees them again. The reason is because he understood his job in such a way that if he did not butcher the meat in such a way that kept it kosher, that God's presence would break out and kill him. It was a desperate thing. As God's people are moving the ark, they are recognizing, they're seeing that they need God's grace. They are not out in front of the ark. They are in procession behind it, walking all of these people over the blood of sacrifices so that the ark may go to one place and stay there and be their hope. Why is this gracious? Let me tell you why. If you get to stand on God's holy hill, if you get to be holy because you're good, you will live in restless anxiety your whole life. You will either have to ignore or minimize your sin, or when sin strikes in your heart, or you fail in some major way, you will suddenly be seized with the thought that you've been let go by God. If you get there by your good works, you have to stay there and manage it by your good works. Why is it good that God shows us how his holiness works? So that we won't think that we can get there on our own. Who is Uzzah? Uzzah is the first guy out of the trenches in the Battle of the Somme. And he teaches us that you can't run at God's holiness with all your goodness and your will and your courage and the nice things you've done, because it will tear you to pieces. We should celebrate the guy. We should have a feast in Uzzah's honor. That he would show us what it means for God to be holy. You and I have to see the grace of God right here in the way that it's lived out in our text. What happens? This is the person, this hill, it wasn't undiscovered territory. God had already been there. He'd already colonized it. He'd already made it holy. You and I cannot approach it without the atoning blood of God between the feet and the ground. This is what Uzzah didn't understand. He thought he needed to protect the ark from the ground. The ground needed to be protected from the ark. God's holiness, he can maintain his own holiness. It's you and I who need to be careful. You don't walk in front, you walk behind. You're holy because he's holy. When David talks about his holiness, God's holiness, when he says, who may ascend, he saw something very dimly that you and I see very clear, which is that God lives to make you and I holy at his own cost. There's going to be another Ark of the Covenant, right? From David, in another 1,000 years, there's going to be another Ark of the Covenant. This time, the Ark of the Covenant is in human flesh. This time, the Ark of the Covenant is Jesus himself. He puts on human skin. If you and I don't get the point, Jesus says, you are to be holy as I am holy, and let me show you how it's done. And he goes up on a holy hill, and he dies, and he bleeds so that you and I could go too. The Ark of the Covenant goes out and makes a path for us so that we can be holy. Do you know that there's another Uzzah too? Remember when Jesus is in the Garden of Gethsemane? He's sweating blood. In comes Judas and the band, the Romans. They're coming in to take Jesus. They're going to take him, they're going to convict him, they're going to execute him. They're going to put an end to him. Somebody steps in the way. Why? Because he sees the ark moving toward the ground. They're going to lay hold of Jesus. Who's the one who tries to step in the way? Do you know? Peter. He steps in the way. The Ark of the Covenant can't hit the ground. God can't be stained by human hands. And Peter cuts off the ear of Malchus, another sad guy who's only known for one thing in the Bible, right? You're that guy who lost your ear. What does Jesus do? He rebukes Peter. Don't you dare try to stop me from hitting the ground. Don't you dare try to stop me from making a way so that unholy people can become holy. This is what he does. As a result, people like you and me and Peter, we get to dwell on his holy hill and not be moved. Who can ascend? Who can ascend but the person whose life has been changed by the gracious, holy presence of God? Weddings in our area run an average of $80,000. I'll let you recover from that for a second. $80,000. Now, we have a fellowship hall that's being renovated, and just know, this church and fellowship hall is available to you members of the church for a much less fee than $80,000. So, just keep it in mind. I read about one of the greatest, most well-known companies that's involved in kind of like the nuts and bolts, A to Z of a wedding. Everything for a fee, they're fantastic at their job. They have lots of different things that they'll do for you. I just want to mention two, one because it's ridiculous and the other one because it applies to the sermon. The first one is, if you have a bride that's getting cold feet, the day of the wedding, she's like, I'm going to get out of here. Then the father of the bride can contact this company and they will produce a hunky Spaniard who will show up at the wedding, claim to be the bride's lost love, and run away with her. All for a fee. Okay. That's not the one that applies to the sermon, though, okay? Here's the one. Some married couples, they want to add some holiness to their weddings, right? We live in a day and age where people are less connected to the idea of the church or holiness or anything, but they know that, you should have holy matrimony. They've heard that word before. Let's do it. One of the things that this company does is they build churches for weddings. So if you need a church for your wedding, they'll just build one, and then you can get married in one, right? I get it. I get the desire to want life to be more holy. What about the rest of your life? You want it to be heavy. You want it to mean something. You want it to be precious to God. You want God to be in it. What are you going to put on the road to make your wedding, to make your life holy, to make your family holy, to make your job holy? Maybe you're here this morning and you know you're not the arrogant who thinks you've got it all together. You're the one who says, the ground of my life is way too messy for God's holiness. He cannot make it right. Holiness isn't for me. That's not possible. There's nothing I can do. There's no church I can build to make my life holy. Maybe that's you. What I want you to think about this morning is this. What if it's possible that God himself has made the ground holy so that even you can walk on it? What if the blood of Jesus is so valuable that it can even handle your feet walking behind it? It may be that today, you've never thought about this, you've always thought it was about behavior modification. Maybe today is the day that for the first time you think, is it possible that God is that loving, that sacrificial, that he could make a way for me, even me? And then you can answer what this psalm says. Who may ascend? You can say, I can, but not because of me. Because Jesus said I can. And he died for me. I want you to think about that. There's an intrusiveness to holiness, but there's also a graciousness. God is on his holy hill. We can walk up. Here's the third one. Holiness is now a rule of life. So what would it mean? Verse 5, it ends, this person will not be moved. What does he mean by that? He means that this person isn't going to be taken off of the covenant, taken away from God's promises, displaced. Now, that's kind of ironic because everything that I read in here about this person seems like they are losing something, okay? You're not allowed to lend an interest to somebody who's desperate. Might cost you some money. You're not allowed to say whatever you want about an enemy, to frame up somebody who may be a bad person. You're not allowed to use your life to advantage yourself over your neighbor. It sounds to me like you're losing something. It sounds to me like you're almost making yourself homeless. How can God ask us to live this way? Well, the psalm is saying that actually what happens here is that you can live this life of integrity because of the love which is from God that makes your life secure. In other words, you can live a displacing, homeless, in effect, kind of life because you have a home with God. So the psalmist is saying, those of you who are secure in the Lord's steadfast love, you have to live these fruitful, holy lives. How does the Heidelberg Catechism, we just read, summarize this? It says, this is my only hope in life and in death, that I dwell secure with the Lord, that I belong to him, and therefore I can live as he's called me to live. Those of you who are like, how do I live a changed life? It starts grace received from God, an understanding of his holiness, and the blood that's been shed to give you a place that can never be moved. The true love that God is calling you to live with is enabled by him. He provides the margin so that we can live this way. Holiness is described here as suffering to keep your word, protecting the reputation of others, loving your neighbor, all of these kinds of things. David is in many ways describing the life he's not going to live. He's going to commit adultery. He's going to send a man to his death. Here's what's interesting to me about that. David, who wrote this, who talked about the man who may ascend, who fails that test in many ways. When he does, he writes Psalm 51. And you know what he does when he writes Psalm 51? He pleads the holy hill of God to cover him. That, my friends, is what it means to be holy. David, the murderer and adulterer, is called the man after God's own heart because of God's holy hill. He looks to God. Let me read to you something from 1 Peter chapter 2. You can write this down in your Bibles somewhere. 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 9 and 10. Look, the Bible describes us this way. You are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for his own possession, that you may proclaim the excellencies of him who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. Once you were not a people, now you are God's people. Once you had not received mercy, now you have received mercy. He says you're holy. Why? Because before you didn't receive mercy, and now you have. Now you have. If I tell you this morning everything's secure, you will not be moved on my own reputation, on my own knowledge of who you are. That may mean something. If God does it, if he says it, you can believe it. You can take it to the bank. The same power that breaks out to Uzziah, that terrifies David, is the same power that says you will not be moved. That is what begins to give us the margin to live different lives. But here's the thing. I want you to read from 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verses 14 through 15. There's an interesting word here. The love of God, the love of Christ, controls us. Because we've concluded this. One has died for all, therefore all have died. He died for all, that those who live might no longer live for themselves, but for him who for their sake died and was raised. The love of Christ controls us. The love of Christ changes our lives. God's holiness, he uses it to create a confessing place for us, to create a place for us to live differently. So we're called to a different kind of life. I'm going to apply this in a way that might be uncomfortable this morning. Let me put it this way. Humble obedience is not negotiable for those who are called to live a holy life. What that means is that you can't be holy and arrogant, going your own way. It also means you can't be holy and completely self-directed. It's a hard thing to preach here. You don't get to live your life. I don't get to live my life any way I choose. The love of Christ controls. The holiness of God draws me to live differently. Holiness is a pattern of life, and it's cut. We follow it. It's cut from Jesus' work. So if you want to know how to be holy, it really starts with one thing. It starts with you saying, show me your way, Lord, that I might follow. You're not going to do it perfectly. You're going to make all kinds of mistakes. But you must start at a place of humble obedience. Show me your way, Lord, that I can follow. I want to end by pointing out that when David brings the Ark of the Covenant in, he brings the Ark of the Covenant in, and all kinds of things happen if you read 2 Samuel 6 through 8. And there's this moment where they sing a song. David composes a song, and the song that they sing has a really interesting lyric, and we used it for a call to worship, and we'll read it in our benediction. Here's what he says. The song that David sang after the ark arrived in Jerusalem, I want you to notice his sense of rest and joy and hope from the holiness of God. He says, oh, give thanks to the Lord, call upon his name, make known his deeds among the peoples, sing to him, sing praises to him, tell of all his wondrous works, glory in his holy name. And then he says this, let the hearts of those who seek the Lord rejoice. Let the hearts of those who seek to follow him rejoice. Not be dour, not be fearful, Not be constantly, comparing themselves to others and other people's standards of holiness, not gossiping, not taking people down a peg, not filled with insecurity, but joy. God's holiness is good news for us. This morning, we're going to observe that at the Lord's Supper. What we're going to do when you come forward in a moment is you're going to lay hold of holiness himself. That Ark of the Covenant, the best way to see it represented now is in the body and blood of Christ laid before us. And the test is here. When you grab these elements, you're going to grab them as one of two kinds of people. You're going to grab them because you're going to say, you know what, I'm pretty good. I've done a good job this week. I can study the Ark of the Covenant. I can grab the elements. Not promising you're going to drop dead, okay? But I am saying this. You want to grab these elements as a person who says, you are on your holy hill, and you've made a path so that I can eat and drink with you. Friends, that is the rule of life. That is the humble obedience lived out. You come to the table with nothing but the righteousness of Christ and the need of him. And you eat and you drink and you rest. That's how we do the Christian life.